I am going to dive in to a bit of housekeeping as we get started. Um, but yeah, for anyone joining, pop your name, where you're from in the chat. It's awesome to see people here. A great way to learn the chat too, because I've got a bit of an activity for the chat for the session today to try to keep it nice and interactive. Because this webinar is a lot of me talking, and I think that is a good place for us to kind of make this a little bit more of a workshop. But firstly, if you don't know who I am already, my name's Tom Maitland. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Raisely. Raisely is an all-in-one fundraising platform for ambitious organisations. Help charities of all shapes and sizes raise money and set up really high-performing campaigns. Prior to starting Raisely, I've worked in charities for nearly a decade now. I was previously the head of digital at a company called Agency, Raisely's parent, where I was working with organisations such as the UN, Amnesty, Greenpeace, run effective digital fundraising campaigns and digital advocacy campaigns. So it is lovely to be here with you all. We do have, quickly find my thing. We do have a bit of a plan for today. I have a bunch of benchmarks and insights to share with everyone today. That's why we're all here. So that is obviously the main part of the presentation today. We then have probably 5 minutes or 10 minutes on a little campaign planning toolkit that we've created kind of off those benchmarks to share with you for you to build on. And then also time for questions at the end. I'm sure plenty will be thrown up. And I've also got a surprise at the end for everyone to share, but we'll talk about that later. Now, a little bit of context as we get started. I just want to talk quickly about the big picture. Now, on this call are hundreds of fundraising experts from charities, so I'm not expecting a lot of this to be new, but I just want to paint the view. I want to bring it close to us to kind of remember it, which is that the pace of online fundraising growth in charities is increased dramatically internationally. It is up 20% year on year over the last few years, which is up from about 7 to 10% annual increase before the start of the pandemic. And that's from the latest Blackboard Giving report. I think the other things that it's worth calling out, if you've been with us for the ride for a little while, or you've been in fundraising for a little while, is that the landscape has changed quite a lot. Back in 2014, 2013, peer-to-peer was unheard of. It was a few campaigns kind of pioneering in the space. And there's been a rapid establishment of peer-to-peer fundraising over the last 5 years, I would say. And we're kind of now at a point where peer-to-peer fundraising is pretty well established in Australia and New Zealand, and it's pretty well established internationally as well. The level of sophistication of a lot of campaigns is high. And I think that's worth calling out. Us as fundraising, as a sector, as charity fundraisers are doing really well. I also just want to state the obvious here. We're in a mobile world. 65% of donations come from a phone. And so when we're looking at kind of all of these insights that I'm about to share, let's kind of keep that lens on it, that people are engaging with their campaigns on their phone, on the go, at least a majority of the time. It's also been reported across the pandemic. So since the pandemic started around March 2020, that more giving has been reported across the spectrum, both in new and recaptured donors. And we do see that a little bit in our insights today. In terms of the vantage point from the data I'm sharing today, we're looking at about $200 million in fundraising. For most of the insights today, we're actually looking at about half that, because I focused things on 2021. We're looking across 6,000 different campaigns, and there's a really wide spectrum in there of appeals, donation forms, peer-to-peer campaigns, event-based campaigns from some of Australia's biggest charities and some of Australia's smallest. So there's a really wide diversity of data across about 1,000 different organisations. Now, I know most of the people on our call today, because of the time, are from Australia or New Zealand. We do have a few folks from other places across the world. A lot of the data we're sharing today is Australia and New Zealand data. That's kind of where we've honed things down, because that's where we find it avoids a bit of noise when we're doing the analysis, particularly around currency conversion. Now, the thing I wanted to kind of just call out here, and why I wanted to introduce you to the chat, is that we have a call full of experts. There are over 200 experts on the call today, people who do fundraising in charities, who look at your own data, know lots of things. And so I firmly believe, and why we do this, is that sharing lessons learned between fellow organisations, fellow charities, lifts us all up. I would love if there's something that I'm sharing today that is novel to you, or you disagree with, or differs from your experience, or you've got an experience of a campaign that confirms it or substantiates it, that you post that in the chat and share that with everyone here. If you're willing to, because I think that those kind of lessons beyond the view that I've got, that we've got here at Raisley, is really important. So the data we're looking at today is anonymised aggregated data from across Raisley campaigns in 2021. Unless I say otherwise, there's a few times where we've kind of done comparisons to previous years. The process we've come to for this data is quite rigorous. So whenever we present data, we try to make sure that we are following data science best practices, that we're focusing on statistical significance, that in places that it's required, we're removing outliers, and we've cleaned things up. And that's just to give you a better indication of, a more accurate indication of the numbers that we're giving you today. And as I said before, we're only looking at Australia and New Zealand. We treat the currencies as the same, they're close enough for this kind of information. And lastly, before I launch in, some definitions, just in case these terms aren't familiar to you. The two terms I'm going to be throwing around a lot today are peer-to-peer campaigns. A peer-to-peer campaign is campaigns where your supporters sign up. They're often to do a challenge, ask their friends, and they ask their friends and family for donations. Donors are donating to their friend. In peer-to-peer campaigns, this category, we've included things like community hubs, in memoriam pages, other kinds of community fundraising. Any kind of peer-to-peer campaign is lumped into that. And then we also have appeal campaigns, which we've used to cover any kind of broad direct appeal for donations from a charity. So that includes a donation form on a website, a regular giving page, a disaster appeal, advocacy crowdfunder, giving days, and other seasonal appeals. So just hopefully that kind of starts us off all on the same page in terms of what these things mean. Now, the other thing I will say is in terms of structure for today, this webinar is recorded and we'll share the recording and the slides with you after. And we really welcome questions. I do have the chat open and I can kind of see some coming through as I'm talking. I'll try to answer them if it makes sense, but really we've kind of got one time at the end for questions. The best way to ask a question is to use the Q&A. It's like two little speech bubbles and the Q&A button down the bottom of the Zoom call, and we'll get to those at the end. All right, I'm going to launch in. We're going to start with some benchmarks. Raisley's updated benchmarks, and these are really a cross-section of all of Raisley's 2021 data to try to find a common experience across fundraisers, across charities, across campaigns. Benchmarks are useful for you to plan an upcoming campaign and understand how that campaign might go. And that's something we'll talk a bit about at the end. They're also really useful for you to compare your own campaigns against to understand if you're above or below benchmark. And that might inform optimization efforts or strategy efforts within your campaign. Now, I just want to kind of state here, by their nature, benchmarks are the middle ground. Benchmarks aren't things that are like, they're not amazing results, they're not bad results. We're not talking here about Raisley's top campaigns. Instead, we're looking at the average between campaigns. Some of those might have small or limited resources for advertising and engagement, and other campaigns have big teams and big budgets behind them. So we're really looking at the middle of those. All right. So I want to start with some basic stats, and we will kind of get a little bit more complex on the maths as we go. So for 2021 data, our mode donation amount, our most common donation amount is $50. Every time we've cut this data, every time we've done this analysis on an individual campaign, that is pretty much always true, and that has been true for the last 3 years. Our median donations, that is the middle of the range, is $30, and our mean, our average donation is $41. And this is for appeals and donation forms, not peer-to-peer campaigns. They're coming up next. For the mean, we've excluded outliers because outliers change that mean pretty dramatically. They almost double it. Well, they over double it actually, moving it up to $88 when we include outliers. So there's just some basic benchmarks for you to think about for your appeals and donations. What about regular giving? Well, we see a $20 mode for monthly donations. So most people don't, so the most common monthly donation we see on the platform is $20. There's a slightly higher average than that of $30, again, for monthly donations. When we look at weekly donations, the most common amount for a weekly donation is $5. The average for weekly donations is $23, which I think is interesting when you obviously think about the frequency of a weekly donation over a monthly one. There's quite a lot of value in those numbers, despite them being lower. And I can see Andrew's asked how we define outliers. It's a really good question. For this data, outliers are the top, the 10% on either side. So the bottom 10% and the top 10% is kind of the data that we've excluded. All right, but what about peer-to-peer campaigns? Well, here the numbers are different, and we're seeing a starker difference in donation values between peer-to-peer campaigns and appeal or regular giving campaigns than we have seen in the past. Still, $50 is the most common donation amount, but we have a higher median at $50 as well. And the mean is at 47, or slightly higher with outliers, quite a bit higher with outliers included. So you can see here that is, I mean, the median there is $20 higher for a peer-to-peer campaign than an appeal campaign. And I think that's kind of one of the first insights that I wanted to put out here, that peer-to-peer campaigns now have a higher median donation value. And that wasn't the case back in 2019 when we first did this data. The median in peer-to-peer campaigns was $50 and $30 for non-peer-to-peer campaigns. Why is this the case? Well, we looked into that, and it's because donation values to peer-to-peer campaigns have been growing over the last 3 years, but donation amounts to appeal campaigns have not. And we've got a table here to illustrate that. So in this table, we can see the median for both peer-to-peer campaigns and the median for appeal campaigns over the last 3 years. And the insight here, the interesting thing here is that we can see that for appeals, donation forms, appeal campaigns, the median's barely moved. But for peer-to-peer campaigns, it's been consistently increasing with a sharp jump in 2020 and then a slight increase in 2021. Which represents that difference, and I think is really interesting in kind of the sophistication and the investment and the different nature of peer-to-peer campaigns compared to their other fundraising counterparts. And so that's kind of another insight, and I've got these kind of throughout the slide as like little takeaways for you. And of course, this is my own analysis, but people are being more generous when giving to peer-to-peer campaigns. That's shown through that consistent growth in those donation amounts. And I think that is because both donors are being more generous, and also charities, us, we're all more sophisticated in how we ask. And we are optimizing our campaigns better to optimize for that donation value. All right, well, let's look into those donation amounts a little bit more. Again, this is a frequency analysis. We do this a lot, and I would encourage you to do this on your campaigns as well. It is essentially looking at all of the donations across the platform and saying, well, what are the buckets they fill into, and what are the top 5? And the top 5 here are 50, 20, 100, 30, and 10. When we've done this analysis in the past, it's pretty common to see common donation amounts clustering around currency note values. These are like, notes that you would actually have in your wallet. These do correlate to an extent with Brazeley's default donation asks. And that probably has an influence here as well. But even when we've done this analysis within an individual campaign, within individual campaigns that don't have the default amounts, again, we see a very similar pattern. We see $50 being the most popular or the most common amount chosen, and then similar kind of 20, 30, 100 in similar proportions. However, in our experience, the dollar amounts, excuse me, the dollar amounts on your campaign is the single greatest lever that you have to adjust donation values. And you can successfully ask for a little more from enough donors to make a substantial impact on your overall fundraising. This does change a little bit compared when we split this data by appeal and peer-to-peer campaigns. The general kind of proportions are different, the rankings are much the same. So we can see here in this graph that community and peer-to-peer campaigns is a light purple on the bottom, and other campaigns, appeal campaigns, a dark purple on the top. You can kind of see those differences. This graph will be in the slides when you want to have a bit of a poke around it. But kind of to back up my point before about the opportunity to increase gift values, these most common 5 represent about half of all donations, both. So it's a bit more for peer-to-peer, 51%, 44% for appeals, about half. So there's still half of your donations coming in that aren't necessarily on those values, and there's still a substantial opportunity for you to be increasing people off those values, which I guess is kind of a takeaway I want to leave you with from this data, that you should be using your donation form dollar buttons to encourage people to give a little more than those base amounts. And I think you can use this as intelligence on where you might set your dollar handles. And in our experience, when we've done A/B tests, even just increasing these values by, say, $5, so 55, 35, can make a material difference on the campaign and the amount that you're able to raise. So that's donation amounts. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about campaign velocity. And this is the first time we've done this kind of analysis. And what we've tried to do is look at a typical timeline for a campaign, both a peer-to-peer campaign and an appeal campaign, to find some insights to help you think about the timelines you might plan for when you're running your own campaign, and compare that against the average experience. And the 2 key takeaways here are that about 40 days from the start of a peer-to-peer campaign is when almost all profiles are created. It's really in that first month and a bit. And for a peer-to-peer campaign, most campaigns raise their revenue in 2 to 3 months, about 2.5 months. And I've got some visualizations to help you picture this. So again, we're just looking at peer-to-peer campaigns for now. The top graph here looks at profiles created over time. And so we can see here that nearly 100% of profiles, it's about 95% of profiles are created in that first month. It's a really steep curve, but it's also a linear curve. That first month is pretty constant in its growth. But fundraising obviously happens kind of with a bit of a lag, so that we see us hitting about probably about 40% of our total after the first month, and then the remainder in the following month and a half. Fundraising starts to peter out around 2.5 to 3 months. But as you can see from the shaded area on these graphs, there is a long tail of campaigns who do continue fundraising after that. This is, of course, just the middle of the pack, the average experience. So I think that's really interesting when you're thinking about kind of estimating your revenue, and you might be looking at a month into your peer-to-peer campaign, and this data would say that, well, okay, a month in, I've probably raised about 40% of my total. I've got 60% to go. I think that can help you with forecasting, or even help you with thinking about strategies to boost the engagement and activation within your campaign. What about versus like peer-to-peer versus appeals? Now, I think it's probably conventional wisdom, and no one would be too surprised that an appeal is quicker than a peer-to-peer campaign. That's what we see is what we'd say. And I think the data here is confirming that. So typically we see a peer-to-peer campaign run for around 2.5, 3 months. And other campaigns, appeal campaigns, are much shorter. Donations start to slow down after about 4 to 6 weeks. I think the interesting thing here is, for me, I thought peer-to-peer campaigns might run a bit longer, that we might be kind of more pushing towards that 3.5, 4 months time frame, but yeah, it really is kind of defined to that period. This was a really interesting visualization on profiles. So back over to peer-to-peer campaigns, just wanted to highlight profile creation. And the graph here shows the proportion of profiles that are created for a campaign against the months since the campaign started. And so you can really see that in that first month, profiles are rapidly created in a fairly linear fashion, up to about 100% after that, first 5 weeks or so. we often get asked from folks, when do I start promoting my campaign? Should it be 1, 2, 3 months out from launch? What's the best kind of time frame to operate within here? And I just want to say, like, while we haven't analyzed success versus lead time, we haven't analyzed like how long you give signups versus how much you raise. The experience for most campaigns is about 6 weeks of ramp up for a P2P campaign before your challenge starts. And so I think that's kind of like a helpful insight and helpful input for you as you're planning out your campaign. I think the takeaway here is that you can use these benchmarks to help you plan for the intense moments of the campaign. And so if you're running a P2P campaign, you want to allow about 6 weeks for acquisition. And if you're running an appeal, then you probably want to allow about a month. I think that the key thing here is that we need to make the most of these intense periods, both through activations, through activation. So like rewards, competitions, matched giving, things that we can do throughout a campaign to keep the energy level high. I'm going to talk about this soon when we come to some modeling we've done on profiles, but activation and engagement with campaigns consistently is key. And so I think like if you're seeing a bit of a dip after, say, 2 weeks after the challenge starts, then that's a great time to do something like run a competition or do a match giving period to bring people back and kind of make the most of that period that you've got for the campaign. This is all based on here in terms of some summary stats to leave you with. About 50% of campaigns raise their total in 9 to 10 weeks, but some campaigns, the slowest 25% of campaigns can take 5 months. And for appeals, again, 50% of campaigns raise their total in 6 weeks, and the fastest 25%, the fastest quarter of campaigns can raise their total in 4 weeks. Just to kind of give you those benchmarks to go on with. All right, I think this is one of our final kind of campaign benchmarks, which is just when a donation's made. And if anyone here has seen kind of our 2019 or 2020 presentation on 2019 data, we looked at this, and honestly, not much has changed. So we're kind of looking at data for both when people like to donate and when they're asked to donate. So I wouldn't be using this data to say that like X is the best time to ask. And really, there's really a lot of correlation here. But this might help you plan activation for your campaign. Here's the graph. And what we learn from it is that Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays are the most common days for giving. Evenings, 4 to 7 p.m. are the most common time to give. And there's another little bump at about 10 a.m. And giving on the weekend is fairly quiet. And that's across peer-to-peer and appeals. When we haven't split it here, but when we have in the past split this by peer-to-peer and appeals, it looks much the same. These trends haven't changed over the years. So I think it's like a good kind of context to keep in mind for when people are online and giving and when people are asking, both your fundraisers and yourselves. I am also wanting to include some conversion rates. So we've been talking a lot about kind of benchmark data. What about actually website data? And here we're looking at appeals. And so for appeals, the benchmark conversion rate you should be looking at, so this is in terms of the number of visitors you get against the number of donations you get, is about 7 to 8% across the platform. But for well-optimized appeals, ones that kind of are seizing a moment or have really optimized their page and their copy, they're sending good traffic, really like 15+% is what we see, with some campaigns, some kind of reaching 30, 35%. So trying to use that as a guide when you're looking at your own Google Analytics in the e-commerce section, the conversion rate is what you want to kind of be measuring against there. The insight here goes to that 2 to 8%. The range of conversion rates varies greatly by source. And that's kind of the point I wanted to highlight here, which is that where your donors come from can affect your page performance a lot. So if you're seeing low conversion rates on your appeal, first check the source of your traffic and how qualified it is. In our overall data, search traffic from Google has a very poor conversion rate, and other low intent traffic. So you might be running like a display campaign where you've posted ads on the SMH or something like that, that doesn't convert as well as traffic from email or traffic from social. And of course, Facebook and Instagram shine. They account for a whopping 34% of conversions. To wrap this section up, I wanted to give you a few top three takeaways. And they are, if you remember three things today, peer-to-peer donation values are growing, they're up. $50 is still our most common donation, but average gifts have been moving higher, and peer-to-peer campaigns are now higher than appeals. The first month of a peer-to-peer campaign is key. Getting everyone signed up in that first month is the typical experience, and campaigns wrap up after 3 months. Don't expect it to go much faster than that. And lastly, thirdly, your traffic sources matter. So when you're looking at an appeal campaign, conversion rates will vary a lot compared to where that traffic is coming from, and make sure you're optimizing your advertising. And remember that direct traffic, traffic from like an email list that you've maybe warmed up, is always going to convert highest. So they were our broad campaign benchmarks. Give everyone a hot minute to digest that, to digest all that information. I hope it's interesting and helpful. The next bit I want to talk about is, I'm going so behind time. The next bit I want to talk about is peer-to-peer benchmarks. And so this is where we're really honing in on peer-to-peer campaigns, and kind of asking, what should you focus on when you're running one? The first statistic I want to give you is activation. Activation, at least how we define activation, is when someone, a profile, so someone signs up to your campaign and they raise their first dollar. They receive their first donation. On average, across the platform, 55% of fundraisers, individual fundraisers, activate their page, aka they receive a donation. 36% of profiles receive a donation from others. The gap there is people who self-donate and then don't receive anything else. Now, this is interesting in context. When we did this data back in 2019, the activation rate across the platform was 30%, and that was compared to the 55% now. So that has gone up dramatically by 25 points. And I think that shows a lot of sophistication in marketing automation that charities do, in your kind of engagement and your coaching, and also I think upgrades to the platform, where we've added badges and better gamification. We'll talk a little bit about those later. But that's really handy benchmark to know. Let's talk about average raised. Again, this has been going up. So with outliers excluded, the average amount that an individual fundraiser raise across the platform is $381. For teams, $1,624. Yeah, that's outliers excluded. And then what about goals? Well, the most common and the median goal for individual fundraisers is smack bang on 500. The average, again, outliers excluded, is 464, and again, higher for teams at about 1,500. But the really interesting thing here is, again, how this has changed. And so I've got a table here of profile totals over time, again, looking at the last 3 years. And we can see that they've increased. Back in 2019, the mean, again, with the same technique of outliers removed, was 332. It increased quite a lot in 2020, and has decreased a bit again in 2021, but is still growing, trending up. And that is both the mean, the average, and the median. And so profile totals, people's fundraising success, is growing across the board. And we do kind of dig into why that might be happening, informed by this next slide, which is the number of donations per profile. So obviously the ingredients to a peer-to-peer fundraiser is I need to sign up, I need to activate, I need to get people to donate to me. I want those people to donate a lot, and I also want a lot of people to donate. And so the average number of donations that we see for an individual is 7.3, and for teams, directly to teams, not to individuals in teams, is just under 5. These numbers have not changed substantially over the past 3 years. They have moved percentage point, moved decimal points around. They have really not changed. And so I think what that says is that the increase, fundraising totals are trending up over the last 3 years, but that increase has been caused by higher donation averages, not necessarily more donations. So people are getting about the same number of donations, but those donations are higher, which is all kind of a consistent story based on those benchmarks I showed you before. I think it's fair to say that this, combined with the substantially higher activation rate, it's fair to conclude that peer-to-peer fundraising is generally much more successful now than it was before the start of the pandemic. And that's pretty remarkable as an industry. I think there's a lot for all of the fundraisers on this call to celebrate there. All right, I have two models to show you and to talk through. And in these models, we're looking at profile activation and then total raise. These really are the two ingredients. Once you've actually acquired a fundraiser, you need to activate them, you need to get them to raise their first dollar, and then you want to encourage them to hit their goal, to raise as much as possible. And so that's what we're looking at here. In terms of profile activation, we wanted to get an understanding of the different factors that influence whether or not someone will activate, aka receive a donation. And so we looked at all of the common things a fundraiser is asked to do when they sign up to a campaign. That's things like share, log an activity if it's a fitness campaign, upload a photo, post a blog, all of those kinds of things that are common across peer-to-peer fundraising and across any platform. And so then we modeled the relationship of those attributes against the chance a profile will activate, either positive or negative. And here's what we came up with. Now, what this says is that sharing a profile is the single most important thing that someone can do in order to activate. It can lead to a 47 percentage point increase in the chance that a profile is activated. So to try to interpret that a little bit better, a profile is 20% likely to activate if they don't share, and 67% likely to activate if they do share. And this sharing, in terms of our attributes, is via Raisely. So they would have their dashboard and they would click a share button on their profile page or on their dashboard, because that's where we can track it. And that is what's recording this kind of big impact. So that really is the first thing to be focused on. When we did this data in 2019, we didn't have that available to us. Then we see a bunch of other attributes making a difference. They're all much the same. They are things like adding a photo, being a member of a team, adding a blog post, and donating to themselves. I think I actually should not be there. Things like logging activities also are relevant, as well as adding a description. So all of those things are important for activation. There are some things which statistically detract from activation, like starting a team, and activity campaigns have lower activation rates. But the thing to understand here is that all of this is additive. So, for example, if I do all of these things, then I have a 90% chance of activating versus a 5% chance if I do none of these things. So I might add a photo and be a member of a team, and that increases my chance by just under 40 percentage points. We also ran this model for 2020 data to see if there'd been much of a change, and there wasn't really a notable one. The order changed slightly, but yeah, it kind of functionally the same in terms of the importance of all of these different things. There are two insights just that I want to kind of pull out here. And that is, firstly, that data proves that sharing is the most important thing a fundraiser can do to get activated. Not surprised, we aren't either, but I think the impact was a bit surprising, and the difference between the other things that they could potentially do. But sharing the fundraising page from your dashboard is absolutely massive when it comes to that activation metric. Little tip, in Raisely, we have a field that indicates when someone has shared. It's what we based this analysis on. And you can use marketing automation inside Raisely or outside Raisely to prompt people to share when they haven't, and to award badges when they share, and do all sorts of things to incentivize sharing. So there are really practical ways that you can encourage people to share, and you can congratulate them when they have shared via our tools. And the field is called shared, just on profiles. Second insight is that engagement has a really strong correlation with activation. The main thing that we see here is that the more engaged someone is with your campaign, the more things that they're doing, the more likely they are to activate. So getting your fundraisers to complete their profile is key. Again, we try to promote this within the dashboard by having a little complete your profile helper where they can do all of these steps in order to get to 100%. And we've seen that obviously have a big impact on all of these things on activation generally. I have a second model for you, which is profile totals. Once someone has activated their campaign, what are the factors that influence how much they raise? And we looked at a very similar thing. We looked at all of the things that they can do, and we tried to understand kind of how they correlate with their fundraising total. And here's that model. Now we exclude self-donations and offline donations here. And the thing to understand is we're looking at multipliers. So if someone does all of these things, then they're expected to raise 10 times the amount of a profile that has done none of those things. And so just to illustrate that, a fundraising profile who does all of these things is expected to raise about $1,500 compared to the average unengaged profile who doesn't do anything, might raise about $155. And so the way to interpret this data is that in the first line there, that having a description, profiles with a description, raise 2.5 times more the amount of profiles without a description. Now that could be a default description, it can be a customized description, but there just needs to be something on the page to tell people what this fundraiser is doing and why they should give. You can then kind of move down that list. I won't read them all out. You can kind of read these in the slides a bit later. But thanking donors is really important. That's the first time we've looked at that flag in this data, along with adding the blog post. It increases the amount you raise by about 1.2 times. Adding a photo, blogging activities, all of those kinds of things are important. Interestingly, sharing a profile is not important to the amount someone raised. It is really important to activation, but kind of from there, it's not a factor that we see making a big difference. And the other insight here is that activity campaigns generally in this data are raising a bit less than non-activity campaigns. So they're ones that you're recording fitness or exercise activity on a per profile basis, which was interesting to come through. So the insight here is that having a page description is the most important part of fundraising. Can easily get overlooked, but even if the fundraiser has that default description, that's key. That's been fairly consistent whenever we looked at this data. That was similar in 2019. The other change here is we again ran this model for 2020, and the biggest difference was that logging activities now has a significant impact on fundraising. So that's where I connect to my Strava or I log into my dashboard and I manually say I've done a 10K run today, I wish. That now has in 2021, that has a statistically significant impact on how much someone raises. It's not the most important thing, but it is important compared to 2020, where that had no impact. No significant impact. So I think kind of the theory why we looked at that was because virtual campaigns and virtualization and all of that is kind of becoming a trend, it's becoming part of people's lives. And so I expected to see that reflected in the data, and it was interesting that it was. A few little website performance things, and then we'll get on to questions. We might need to go a bit over if people have got time. Firstly, 65% of all fundraising comes from the top 10% of profiles. So I just want to kind of, I think if you've ever done analysis of your own data, you might see that you've got some really active fundraisers that contribute a lot to your total. And we kind of see that across the board. 52% comes from the top 5%. Really disproportionate. The key insight here is obviously to celebrate your high achievers because they really make a big difference to your fundraising campaign. And we also have some kind of interesting website performance stats in terms of acquisition just to share with you today, which are with about 48% of signups come from mobile devices. 70% of signups are email or direct or referred traffic. So that's like the single biggest acquisition source for signups, emails or direct traffic. About 16% of signups come from social networks across the board. And 14% of signups come from organic search. And again, we talked a bit about conversion rates for donations. We've got the same for sign-up pages, and it varies a lot compared to the source of the traffic. So we might see about a 25% conversion rate for direct traffic, sent traffic you send via email, and then we see that dropping right down to about 18% for social traffic. Makes sense. If you're advertising on Facebook, you're reaching more people, and those people are not always familiar with your charity or might need a little bit more convincing. All right. That is all of the data that I have to share in my half an hour presentation. It's gone for 45 minutes. There are two things I wanted to share with you really quickly. The first is a bit of a campaign planning toolkit, and kind of the question I've had when people are looking at this data is like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? And a really easy way is to do some maths. Because ultimately, particularly in terms of peer-to-peer fundraising, it is just maths. And these benchmarks are really handy for planning your future peer-to-peer campaigns. And so what we've done is create a quick little peer-to-peer planner. We'll send out the link in an email afterwards. You can scan the QR code on your screen to access it if you would like to. But I'll just show you that really quickly so you understand kind of what it is and what I'm talking about and why these benchmarks will matter. One second, I just need to change my share. All right, so the peer-to-peer planner is a little handy Google Sheet. You can make your own copy of it. You can customize it as much as you like. Just wanted to build this tool to really kind of apply the data in practice. And here's how it works. It looks at your campaign levers. So these are things that you can control in terms of your campaign. You can direct traffic. You might be paying for that traffic, so you might have a cost per acquisition. You can control your website sign-up rate to an extent. You might say, I'm going to spend some time optimizing it to make it higher. You can control your average donation amount, your participant activation rates, and your donations per person. But you'll see that we've popped in our benchmarks for all of these things. You can then pop into the spreadsheet estimates. And so you could say, or it actually calculates those estimates. So for example, if I'm only directing 5,000 visitors to my campaign, then I might only have 1,000 participants, 550 active participants, and my total fundraising might be about $200,000 for my campaign. The calculator does a few other things. It also looks at your costs. So you might be paying a little bit of money to acquire people, say on Facebook ads or something like that. You might be paying an agency or a graphic designer or another professional to help you with your campaign. And you also have payment processing fees for Stripe. And so what we've done here is you can pop in your costs. It'll automatically calculate an estimate for your payment processing. You get net revenue from fundraising and a return on investment. And so hopefully you can then kind of pop all of this in, get a bit of a scenario for your campaign, really back of the envelope numbers, using those benchmarks to help you estimate things. The final thing we wanted to include in this was some other scenarios. Like, obviously, like then I'm building the campaign and making that happen. Maybe I'm in my second year. What am I actually optimizing? Well, you could focus on a few different things and you could see the impact of those. So if I increase my conversion rate of the sign-up form from 20 to 25%, that might result, again, back of the envelope numbers, in like a 50% increase, a $50,000 increase in this particular scenario to how much I raise. Maybe I call all of my fundraisers and I increase my activation rate to 50 to 70%. Well, that might also result in about a $50,000 increase to the $200,000 that I was planning to raise. Maybe you go really broad and you put your campaign everywhere. It's on every billboard in the city and you get loads and loads of traffic, but it's not as qualified, so your conversion rate drops. What is the impact of that going to be as well? And you can also add your own scenarios here where you can kind of do those maths. So I hope that's a little helpful tool. Feel free to copy it, modify it, go for it. Benchmarks are in there, and that's kind of how you can put all of this into practice. All right, the final thing, I had one more thing, which was I couldn't help when we had a few people on a call to share a little bit of extra news, which is we have a new template releasing really soon. And I'm really, really excited to show it to you. As you know, appeals are the lifeblood of so many organizations, and I'm sure many of you run them multiple times a year. And we think it should be easier to set up a well-optimized appeal that allows you to tell a really rich and engaging story for your campaign. And so we took a lot of the best practice we've shared today, we've shared in our Giving Days webinar last year, and we bundled them all into our new template. The team's been working on it for a few months now, and we wanted to give you all of the different building blocks you can use for your next appeal at Giving Day, stripped back. It can be a simple text-based appeal, or fleshed out, it can really be a full, rich narrative that you're telling your donors. And so I really quickly wanted to show you that template. It's going live in probably a week. So this is my little sneak peek. Again, let's change that share. This is what it looks like. It's a really beautiful design, focusing on imagery and donation forms really high up the page, optimized for conversion. It's a great starting point for giving days, appeals, emergency appeals, all of those kinds of things. It goes through spaces to build stories, to talk about the impact of your campaign, to talk about kind of why giving matters, to show quotes, to provide social proof and evidence as to why people should give, to talk a little bit about your charity, to add giving walls, and a nice kind of close to the appeal there. But behind the scenes, there are so many more templates when you start, so many more rows and layouts here available to you when you start using this template once it goes live. So we'll send an email when it's up, but I couldn't help myself but show it to you all today as well. That is coming soon, a really beautiful new appeal template. Like everything on Raisely, it is mobile optimized. It looks great on mobile. It has floating donation buttons and really lovely interfaces there. And it's really like I'm 20 minutes late, so I'm going to shut up now. If you are able to stay on, I think we can probably take questions for the next 10 minutes, and we'll close the session off at 11 o'clock. But if you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box of the chat, and I'll get to those. So I'm just going to pop that reminder, Q&A box. If you're out of time, if you need to run, that's my email address. Feel free to flick me any questions over email and I'll do my best to answer them. All right. So questions. So Debbie's asked if they donate to themselves. I'm just the challenge of having with these questions is the context. Debbie's asked if they donate to themselves, doesn't that activate their profile? Yes, it does. So for the model that I showed you before around profile activation, flick over to it. This one, the donated to self line shouldn't be there because yes, donating to self is 100% chance of activation. So I think that one's just an error. So I would just ignore that. There's been kind of a few questions here around correlation, causation, which I think is a good one. So sharing your page, so like a lot of this data, I think all we can talk to is the relationship between things, not necessarily the order that things happen or what caused those things to happen. So certainly when we're looking at a model like this or the fundraising total one, we're definitely seeing correlation there. What we're saying is these are the things that successful fundraisers do, not the things necessarily that cause a successful fundraiser. It's a model of what looks like, what a successful fundraiser looks like. And what you're able to do then is take those insights and encourage your fundraisers to do these particular things. And I would say that it's the encouragement of these things or making these things easy that helps them get to the kind of results that we're seeing here. I hope that makes sense. Jonathan's asked something about the new template, which was an eagle-eyed, so I raced through it. The new template does have a quote block that slides through different quotes that will be available to all campaigns on Raisely, along with a bunch of other blocks that we've released recently, like a countdown timer and a few other neat little things. Someone has asked, Becky has asked around the time to send communications. If we send an SMS the night before the event, was 5 to 7 p.m. best. Our data doesn't say this, I'm afraid. And so what we found is that around 5 to 7 p.m. is when people are generally donating. It's hard to say if that's the best time to ask, but I would say that if that is what we're seeing in terms of online activity. Like that's when people are online, when they are giving, when fundraisers are asking their friends for donations, that it is probably a time of activity. And then I would posit that that is a good time to send an email, but it's just not something that the data kind of says definitively. Doris has asked about the added description relating to this graph here, the added description kind of relating to the amount raised. What we've found, so here we've just looked at the fact that someone has a description. And of course, for a lot of campaigns, you might just do a default description. We didn't do it in this analysis, but in the past, we have looked at the difference between a default description and a customized description, and there was no significant difference. It's really just the fact that there is a description on the page. And so, yes, adding a default description is one of the easiest things that you can do to help people raise money. I think when we did that analysis a few years ago, it was really like a personalized description might help them raise 10 to 20% more. Jesse's asked if we excluded registration fees from this data. Registration fees in this data will be considered a self-donation, so they have generally been excluded. When we're looking at things like fundraising totals, then they will also be excluded. So if a registration fee doesn't get counted in your campaign settings, it doesn't get counted towards fundraising totals, then when I've shown you fundraising totals, then it hasn't been included there. Someone's also asked, are the analytics on lead conversion and drop-off coming from Google Analytics? Yes, they are coming from Google Analytics. We do want to build more analytics into Raisely in the future, but at the moment you would see those in Google Analytics, and if you don't have Google Analytics set up, then you can just pop in your analytics code and we kind of track it all automatically for you. Clicking through these to see if there's anything else. We've got an out there question. Is there an option for a peer-to-peer fundraiser to embed their own donation form connected to their fundraiser? I'd probably say that the answer here is no. It is possible to embed a Raisely donation form for a particular fundraising profile. So you could give them an embed code that they paste on their own website for people to donate to them. It's not a common thing we've seen people wanting to do, though. Jesse's asked, do we have consent to marketing and mobile phone as standard fields on the new template? We don't at the moment. It's a good idea. There are things that we could add in. They're, of course, quite easy to add in if you want to in your future, just via custom fields. They're nice and easy. Josephine has asked, I talked about donations by day and time. What about month? Is there a best month to launch a campaign? We haven't done the analysis, so I can only speak from personal experience and what we see happening on the platform. But generally, we see two big periods for peer-to-peer fundraising in Australia and New Zealand. They are from February through to June, and we see kind of it quieten off a bit in June as tax time appeals take over in July, and then they launch again in August through to about the end of November. So I would say that's just the general activity you see across the platform. It might mean that there's an opportunity for you to launch a peer-to-peer campaign in June, July, or December, January, but I'll kind of leave you to interpret that as kind of much as you like. Doris has asked, with the average sign-up conversion rate from social being 18%, is that with ads directing to the homepage or the sign-up page? That is with traffic, so that the conversion rate is traffic that lands on the sign-up page that then goes on to convert. So you would think that probably would be like there'd be drop-off on the homepage as well before it gets to the sign-up page and looks at that conversion rate. We do find a lot of campaigns do direct their traffic directly to the sign-up page. I think if you're doing that, you really want to optimize the sign-up page to actually include some information about your campaign, because by default, the sign-up page is like just a form and there isn't really much context there as to the campaign. Someone asked, does charging a registration fee impact overall results? Do events with registration fees raise more, engage more fundraisers? This isn't data that we've looked into yet. So I think it's a good question, and I might kind of see if we can do some analysis offline and get back in touch. But yeah, we don't know. Anecdotally, we definitely hear of kind of smaller campaigns who might earn half their revenue from registration fees. They can be really significant. But yeah, here we're really just looking at fundraising. I think that might be a wrap. Oh, Jonathan's asked, do we have much data yet, or can we track the success of QR codes via the new block? We don't have any data on it yet. It will be good to have that data. But of course, yeah, and Jonathan's referring to a block that lets you download fundraisers, lets fundraisers download a QR code that links to their fundraising page. So I don't have any data on it yet, but I think that might be something that we might want to do in the future. I think I'm going to pause there. We will share these slides and the recording, so you can go back over this lovely template we're launching soon as well. So get excited about that. But there's my email again. If you do have any questions, or if I didn't get to your question because I don't think I've been able to see them all, feel free to flick it to me over email, and if I can answer it, I will, or I'll tell you I can't. But yeah, thank you everyone so much for joining us today and for coming along. I hope this has been helpful. I hope this helps you plan your fundraisers for 2022. We're always here to help if you have any questions or you need a hand. Thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays.